Title of this lecture is A Man, a Plan, a Canal, Panama. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that particular title. It's not unique to me. Many other people talking about the Panama Canal use this same title. There's actually, I think, a video. One of the videos has this name. Does anybody know why we all use this title? It is a palindrome. And a palindrome is a word or a phrase or a number that going forward or backward reads the same. You can change capitalization and how the words split up, but it is in fact one of the very nice, fairly long palindromes. I'm not going to talk about the very, very early years of Panama today. That will be in my next lecture after we get out of Cartagena, the sea day after Cartagena, which will be an afternoon lecture. But I'm going to start with the California Gold Rush, roughly 1850 or so. When you talk about the California Gold Rush, people were trying to get there from the east coast of the United States out to California, and there were basically three different ways you could get there. You could go around the Horn, around southern South America, which I've done about 6 times recently. I'll do again in December. It's a wonderful voyage if you haven't done that one. But it would take 7 or 8 months in those days on sailing ships. You could go across the Great Plains on a wagon train. That took about 6 months, and there were lots of dangers involved with that one. You could go across Nicaragua. You could literally get down to the mouth of the San Juan River, work your way up the San Juan River, float across the Lake Nicaragua. Many of us were going to do a boat ride on Lake Nicaragua, but we didn't. But you could go across and then go down to San Juan del Sur and catch a boat, or catch a boat going up to California. Take 2 or 3 months. The biggest problem on that one, there weren't very many ships that went that route, and so you may be stuck in San Juan del Sur for literally months waiting for a ship to come that would take you to California. Or the alternative was to go across the Isthmus of Panama, which took usually less than 2 months. There were regular shipping routes at that time that were going from the east coast of the United States or New Orleans down to the eastern side of Panama and then up the west side. There was a regular shipping line that ran up the coast basically like we have done. So there's the map that shows those routes. It doesn't show the Nicaragua one. And in point of fact, nobody has asked me yet, but there has always been talk about a canal in Nicaragua. That will never happen. And it won't happen for a variety of reasons: ecological, not enough water, and also part of the route would be with Costa Rica. And if you learned anything about Costa Rica yesterday, it was that Costa Rica is very ecological, and they're not going to let a canal be built along the San Juan River. So this map, though, shows the 3 normal routes, and the one through Panama was the safest and easiest route. There was an old Spanish colonial route dated back to the middle 1500s that went from Nombre de Dios or Portobello. I've gone out on a shore excursion when we've spent a day in Cologne and gone out to Portobello, and there's still some Spanish forts and so forth there. But the route that was used in the gold rush was to paddle up the Chagres River to a place called the Cross, Los Cruces, and then from there over to Panama City and catch the boat up to California. This is a painting that was actually done in 1850 by somebody who was doing that route, showing some people being paddled up the river. You notice one boat there in the center that has collapsed. It wasn't a real easy route. There was a lot of risk. Malaria was endemic to Panama in those days and until fairly recently. So there were some risk involved, but it was by far the easiest way to do it. People in New York saw how many people were trying to do this and decided to build a railroad. They incorporated in 1849. They started construction in 1850. Within 2 years, they had the railroad going to the Chagres River and then worked their way along the rest. By 1855, it was completed. And it was, in point of fact, the world's first transcontinental railroad. If you think of a transcontinental railroad as going from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the United States, this was going from the Atlantic or the Caribbean to the Pacific, even though it's only about 50 miles long. In the first years, it was the most profitable railroad in the world. The investors in it made lots of money, and then in 1869 there was a transcontinental railroad across the United States, and that ended the monopoly of the Panama Railroad, and it went downhill from there. But it continues. It's actually still there today. There is a drawing from, I think, about the 1860s, the Panama Railroad, and here is a drawing of one of the ports. This is on the Caribbean side. The name there, Aspinwall, if you see it down at the bottom, was the name of one of the major investors and the president of the steamship line that ran from Panama to California. Notice that it says New Granada. And that's important for our story. In those days, Panama was part of Colombia, which was New Granada in those days. Now, the French built the Suez Canal. And if you're familiar with the Suez Canal, you probably know that it is a sea level canal. It's built in an area that is not geologically very difficult. It doesn't have any mountain ranges that they had to cut through. It's basically a sandy area, fairly easy to build. In fact, the French Canal was the third of the Suez Canals. There was a canal through Suez connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea in the time of the Pharaohs, and there was another one in the time of the Romans. So the French Canal was nothing really super difficult to build. The guy who built the French Canal at Suez was a guy by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps. And he was the head of the French construction. It started in 1881. There's de Lesseps. They did not have very good equipment at that point in time. They had lots of problems with disease. They had no idea what was causing malaria and yellow fever in particular. They were losing lots of people. Many of their workers died very quickly. And they planned on building a sea level canal. They never even figured out that a sea level canal was impossible. On the Caribbean side, the average tide is about 2 feet, which is not difficult to overcome. On the Pacific side, the average tide is as high as 10 feet. And you would have needed locks to adjust for that 10-foot tidal difference on the Pacific side. But the French continued. There is a drawing of their construction. And here a photo of their construction. The equipment just wasn't up to doing the task. They lost estimated 20 to 22,000 people in their efforts. At some points in time, the survival rate of their workers was less than a year. They were having to bring in lots of workers. But the bigger problem for them was that the French Canal was really a Ponzi scheme. The initial investors, the guys who got it going, including de Lesseps, invested a small amount of money. They got lots of other people to invest. It's estimated that about 800,000 people in France invested their life savings in the Panama Canal construction project. And immediately, before any construction started, the original investors pulled out their investment plus lots of extra money. It was a Ponzi scheme where the early investors made money and nobody else did. De Lesseps and others were charged in the court. Ultimately, several of them were found guilty, including de Lesseps and his son. He was an old man at that point, so he didn't go to jail, but he had house arrest. Interestingly enough, one of the people that was involved, one of the early investors, was a man by the name of Eiffel, who you may have heard of. Eiffel ran a company that was promoting construction with prefabricated metal pieces. And the tower that has his name, that was built to commemorate the French Revolution, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, was more than anything just a demonstration of what you could do with prefabricated metal pieces. He sold prefabricated buildings all over the world. I've seen Eiffel churches, for example, in, I have to think back, Arica, Chile, Iquitos, Peru, and in a small town, Santa Rosalia in Baja California. The exact same church came from a kit that was an Eiffel building. But those guys went under. the project stopped. Ultimately, another company took over, the bankrupt company, and did sell off some of the assets, but the original investors, or at least the people who invested their life savings, basically didn't get anything, and it created a big panic in France. When we go through, you will see one spot that you can see a remnant of the French Canal, and it will be after we're exiting. We're on the Caribbean side. If you look back, there is a little channel. It'll be on the port side, and you look back, the Gatun locks are at the far left corner of this picture. I'll point this out again just so you remember to look there. That is part of the original French sea level canal project. They probably got about 40% of the thing done. What really stopped them was the disease and also the backbone of Panama around a place called Culebras. So the French abandoned most of their equipment, and then the story changes over to the United States. In the late 1890s, the United States was looking covetously at some of the Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, particularly Cuba. Many Americans had invested in Cuba, particularly manufacturing people and people raising sugar. And when they were sending their products back to the United States, they were having to pay a tariff. And they thought if Cuba were an American possession, they wouldn't have to pay that tariff, they would make more money. So people began to talk in terms of the United States getting involved with some of the Spanish possessions. And with the possibility of war on the horizon, one of the U.S. battleships was on the Pacific coast, and they wanted to get it to the East Coast, or at least to the Caribbean. That battleship, called the Oregon, sailed along the west coast of Central America, around South America, all the way along. Every time it made a port stop to get more coal, telegrams would go off. People in the United States were following the Oregon, and people began to talk and think if they had a canal through Panama, they wouldn't have had to done it. They would have been able to go right through Panama, and they would have been easily able to transit from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So it was that Oregon that really got people thinking about, we really need a canal there at Panama. Now, Panama was part of New Granada, which was what is today Colombia, and the Colombians weren't very much interested in this. In 1903, the United States Secretary of State worked out a treaty with the Panamanian ambassador in Washington. The U.S. Senate ratified that treaty in March of 1903, but the Colombian legislature did not. They refused to deal with the United States on this. So what Teddy Roosevelt tried to do is get the Panamanians to rebel from Colombia and set up a separate country. So in late October of 1903, there was a revolt in Panama. The Colombians sent a couple of warships to stop the revolt. Amazingly enough, there were some U.S. warships that were there to block the Colombian warships. So the Colombians were not able to get reinforcements in to put down the revolt. Panama declared independence on November 3rd, and 3 days later, the United States signed a treaty with the new Panamanian government, or at least their nominal representative in Washington, D.C., for the U.S. to build a canal. Now, again, this is actually, you may not remember those days, this is pre-internet. It's actually pre-aviation. So communication between Washington, D.C. and Colombia was not real good. So how in the world did Colombia agree to something? It was really one guy in Washington that signed the treaty and got away with it. But Teddy Roosevelt always said, we stole it fair and square. The United States set up a government commission to build the canal in 1904. That commission, among other things, did buy the remaining French equipment, which was pretty much junk. It wasn't much use, and began to plan the construction. The first guy in charge was a man by the name of John Finley Wallace. You see him there. The one story about Wallace is that he and his wife and kids went down to Panama to oversee the construction. When they went down, among the baggage that they took with them were bronze caskets, because they were anticipating they might not survive if they went to Panama. He lasted just a little more than a year, about 14 months. The next guy that they chose as the head of the commission to run the canal was a guy by the name of John Wallace Stevens. He had just completed the Northern Pacific Railroad, the Great Northern Railroad that ran from Minnesota out to Seattle, and was a very successful, well-known railroad person in the United States. There's Wallace Stevens. He did a number of things that assured construction of the canal, successful connection of the canal. First off, before he did anything, he built the towns, the roads, the infrastructure that would be needed, the water systems and so forth. He had the Panama Canal Railroad relocated because he realized that where the Canal Railroad was running was about where you would want to put the actual canal. So he had to have that moved. At one point, he went up to Washington and met with Roosevelt and convinced Roosevelt that a sea-level canal was impossible. You simply could not do it. The biggest problem was that the Chagres River that we saw back in the gold rush era was a river that, on occasion, with heavy rains, would rise as much as 40 feet. And there was no way that you could have a canal at sea level with a river running along it that would have that fluctuation in the amount of water in the river. Wallace Stevens decided that what you'd have to do is dam up that river, use the water for locks, and that would ameliorate the problem of the rise of the river during the rainy season. And the other big thing, and this was based on his knowledge as a railroad man, is he worked out how they would get rid of the dirt that they were excavating. And we will see very easily tomorrow morning one of those results. There's a breakwater on the Pacific side, and that breakwater, as you look out and you see that, it'll be on the starboard side of the ship, the right-hand side of the ship. That breakwater is built with some of the dirt that they took out of the canal. He figured out how to do that and to do it efficiently, to have trains running back and forth, dumping, and so forth. He came up with a type of railroad car that we'll see that was very easily emptied. By the time that the United States was starting real construction, by 1906, and in comparison to the French, 20 years earlier, there were better construction machines. These are big Bucyrus Erie steam shovels that the French had been trying to do this with very small shovels. These were very much bigger. This is a picture that illustrates one of the types of railroad cars that Wallace Stevens came up with, and that is that it's a railroad car that doesn't have sides except on one side. And what that was is that the car could get where they wanted to dump it, and they would literally have like a snowplow that would come along and just take the dirt that's in this car and push it off. The train could move past one of these plow sort of things, and the whole train could be emptied very, very quickly. And that was a Wallace Stevens invention. Here again, different type of car. These were dumper cars, tipper cars. Those are some of the cars that have a side on only one side. Now, the biggest problem area was what's called the area around Culebras, literally the Continental Divide. It was a mountain range that they were going to have to dig their way through, and that's showing here in that spot. And they had constant landslides. When you're trying to excavate in an area that gets a lot of rain, you have to have the side slopes at such an angle that stuff won't fall down all the time. And the deeper they went, the farther, wider they had to go. Lots and lots of landslides all the time. And this is hard rock. This is the Culebras area. They were having to go deeper and wider all the time. Ultimately, they got down to the level of the Chagres River, and they had to use dredges because there was water in here. Those are men digging out a landslide. Couple things in this photo. One, these guys are drilling down, and what they would then do after they dig or drill a hole in the ground, they would put dynamite in, they'd blow it up, and then the steam shovels could come and excavate. But also notice in the picture that most of the people there are black. And here a close-up on some of these guys drilling the holes for blasting. Virtually all of them in the picture are black. More than 80% of the actual workers on the canal for the U.S. were blacks from the Caribbean islands. There was a thought in those days, and it was based somewhat on science, that people from Africa were somewhat resistant to malaria. It has to do with sickle cell, not sickle cell anemia, but full-blown sickle cell. It's the people that are carriers but don't have sickle cell anemia do have some resistance to malaria. It is a genetic change or modification in the human body of people from Africa who lived in a malaria area. It was a survival thing. The problem was that it doesn't resist at all to yellow fever, which was a big problem in the Panama area. But many of those people came in from the islands. They brought them in from Barbados, from many of the different islands by large numbers. Many of the workers, probably about 20%, were white. They came in from Europe, from Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, but engineers and so forth came from Northern Europe or from the United States. There was a very big difference in pay between the black workers and the white workers. Most of the white workers were paid in gold. The black workers, what we'd call obreros, the people that were doing the heavy lifting, they were paid in silver. And the housing that you got depended on whether you were gold or silver, the places where you could eat, the places where you could go. There was segregation. It wasn't always based on race because some of the poorer whites were also paid in silver, but it was based on economic class. This is a photo from 1914 of the headquarters on the Pacific side, Balboa. One of my colleagues at Fresno State was in this area in 1947, took this photo out the window of a plane had just taken off from the airport at Balboa, and that building on the upper right there on the top of the hill, that was the headquarters for the canal project. There's another photograph taken by Dr. Irvin. When he passed away, I inherited his slide collection, and I found these in his slides. There's my picture from 1997 of the headquarters building in Balboa. And, one of the other things, and I think this is something you want to look for as we go through, there are still buildings along the canal that were built either at the time of construction or in the very early years, in the 1920s or 1930s. That was before air conditioning, and one of the things you'll notice is the big roof overhangs. Many of them are built up on stilts so that they're away from the ground. But you'll still see buildings like this. There are several different places where you can look. And if you see a building like that with the roof overhangs, lots of windows, a lot of ventilation, pre-air conditioning, that's probably one that goes back to at least pre-World War II, if not back in the very early days. You can still see a few of those buildings along the route. There's another one, 1997, with that same overhang and lots of windows, or like that. I think these buildings still exist. I've seen those same buildings still there today. This is a picture of one of the gold recreation facilities. They had bowling alleys, but this would only be for the whites, the people, engineers and so forth that were paid in gold. When the French built their canal, or tried to build it, the understanding of disease was not what it was later on, and the thought was that diseases like malaria and yellow fever, some of the others, were caused by bad air. The name malaria simply comes from Latin bad air. In 1877, a British doctor identified mosquitoes as the vector for a disease called elephantitis. It's one of the lesser of the mosquito-borne diseases, of which there are 6 or 7 major ones these days. A French doctor in 1880 identified objects in human blood that are what are referred to as malaria plasmodium. They're actually single-cell parasites that are in the blood, and that's what's causing malaria. So that was identified in 1880. He didn't know how they got in there, but they were in there. There was an interesting British doctor, a young man that was not a very good student. He barely passed college, barely got into medical school. The only place he could find a job was out in India for the British Army. So he went out to India, and somebody gave him the job of trying to figure out what causes malaria. In 1897, just prior to the construction of the canal, he identified malaria as caused by or transmitted by mosquitoes. He won the Nobel Prize in 1902 for that. At the same time, a German doctor or German biologist by the name of Robert Koch demonstrated conclusively that quinine could knock out the malaria plasmodium. People had been using quinine for about 400 years. It's a plant that grows naturally in South America. Actually the Jesuits back in the 1500s had identified quinine as helping reduce malaria incidence, but Robert Koch proved it scientifically that quinine would knock out malaria. He won the Nobel Prize in 1905. And then you may be familiar with the story of in the Spanish-American War, 1898, a man by the name of Walter Reed, an American Army doctor, was running a project to try to figure out what was causing some of the other diseases, particularly yellow fever, and using human subjects by literally having them be bitten by mosquitoes that carried yellow fever, and they got yellow fever as a result. One of his subjects died as a result, but he demonstrated that yellow fever was caused by mosquitoes. And as a result, in Cuba, the first big effort to try to reduce mosquito-borne diseases by sanitation, by eliminating places where mosquitoes breed, and so forth was done very, very successfully. Within a year of Walter Reed's discoveries, they eliminated yellow fever in Cuba, and they greatly reduced malaria. Now, one of the people working with Walter Reed in Cuba was transferred down to the canal project, a man by the name of William Gorgas. And there's Gorgas. He tried to do the same thing that they had done in Cuba in Panama. He went down in 1904. By 1906, they eliminated yellow fever in Cuba. Yellow fever in Panama. They never successfully completely reduced malaria in Panama during the construction, but they reduced it way, way, way down. The U.S. probably lost about 5,000 workers compared to over 20,000 in a much shorter, much smaller project that the French did. And of those 5,000, about 80% were caused by malaria. The other 20%, something like 1,000 people, were accidents, train wrecks, landslides, explosions from the blasting, and so forth. But Gorgas led a campaign to reduce mosquito population by draining swamps, by putting kerosene water with insecticide mixed into it on any water that you had, canals and so forth, by putting in screens, fumigating buildings, anything like that to reduce the mosquito population. There's one story that when Gorgas arrived in Panama, he went to the guy who was in charge of supply and said, this is what I need, and came up with a long list of screens and insecticide and kerosene, so forth. The man threw up his hands and said, all you do is save a few lives. And Gorgas said, well, what if it's your life? And the guy signed the requisition and he got his stuff. But the results of all of Gorgas's work that he did was to really drop the death rate on the U.S. project, particularly compared to the French project. Here's a little video from the Library of Congress. And this is just about 100 years ago. It's after the canal was finished. This is in about 1922 or 1924. But there on the left, there's Gorgas. We actually get to see him. Amazing little video. That's looking over at Balboa, and I think this is on the Caribbean side at Cologne. But he was being interviewed. And again, you can look in the background there, those buildings with the big overhang and screens and so forth. And just coming up here, you'll see a car there on the right that is a clearly early 20s car. They sprayed water on they sprayed oil on any standing water, kerosene mixed with insecticides, perithum insecticides here, just dumping oil on standing water. They did everything they could to clean up the towns, pave the streets, put in good water systems, drainage, sewage. They put up screens on all the windows. In this picture, many of the people are holding ladders, which were used to put up the screens. There is a guy right there in the center that's holding a broom. He's going to be cleaning the streets. They did everything they could to make it a healthier place, and they were very successful about it. Stevens did meet with Teddy Roosevelt and convinced him that a sea level canal was not possible. And then after he got permission to dam the Chagres River, build a lake at about 85-foot average elevation, use locks at each end, and then he quit. And nobody knows exactly why he quit. Some people say he was depressed. Some people say it was marital problems. Whatever, he gave up. And Teddy Roosevelt threw up his hands and said, I'm not going to have that happen again. I've had two guys running the canal project that have quit. So what he did was appoint somebody from the Army Corps of Engineers, a man by the name of George Washington Goethals. And Goethals worked on the canal for about 7 years and did see it to completion. He was experienced in canal construction. He had worked on some of the canals on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. He divided the project up into three divisions: the locks on the Caribbean side, the locks on the Pacific side, and the excavation at Culebras, which was the backbone of Panama, the Continental Divide, the big area where you had the big cut. And these next pictures are ones from the early canal construction, 1907 to 1914. It was a massive project. It was by far the biggest, most expensive project that anybody in the world had ever done. If you've seen any of the videos that have been playing, I think there are some little video clips of these same scenes. They had to build these huge, massive locks. They designed it with swing gates. It was a fairly simple design. People had done things like this before. The middle of the canal is a lake, Gatun Lake. At the time of construction, 1914 completion, it was the biggest artificial lake in the world. Nowhere near that today. Lake Mead, Lake Nasser in Egypt, some of the ones in China and the Soviet Union. But they put that big lake in the middle. One of the things that I like to point out with this map is that people think that you will be going from the west, the Pacific, to the Caribbean in the east. In point of fact, the Caribbean side is farther west than the Pacific side. So we will actually be going northwest as we transit the canal. So there's where we go in at Balboa, and there's where we come out at Cologne. And if you look carefully, this is properly oriented north at the top. Cologne is actually a little bit to the west of Balboa on the Pacific side. In this drawing, we see exactly what we will be doing. We'll come in on the right-hand side at Balboa. We will go up 2 steps, the Miraflores locks. We'll go across the small lake called Miraflores Lakes, and then go across the Pedro Miguel locks, which will raise us 1 more step, and that will get us to Gatun Lake. Gatun Lake was designed to be at 85-foot elevation. It's currently at 82 foot, probably tomorrow. And then on the Caribbean side, we will go in 3 steps at Gatun down to the level of the Caribbean, and we'll transit out near the city of Cologne. We won't be stopping there, but we'll be going by Cologne. Again, on this map, on the bottom right-hand corner is where Panama City is and the town of Balboa used to be. We'll go through the Miraflores locks, cross Miraflores Lake, Pedro Miguel locks. We'll go through the big cut, which I've been using the term culebras all the way along because that's what it was called in those days. It's now more often called the Gaillard Cut. It was named after the engineer, the Army Corps of Engineers. I think he was a colonel that ran the operation there and made the big excavation. He died before the canal was finished. But then we'll cross Gatun Lakes. We'll go to Gatun Locks and down out to the Caribbean. There's Gatun Dam under construction, and there's, as we'll see it today, it'll be off on the left-hand or port side as we cross and get close to the Gatun Locks. It has been modified slightly recently as part of the new construction. They've raised it. They want to get the lake a little bit higher. It hasn't been so successful yet because we've been in a drought the last few years. The canal opened in August of 1914. August of 1914, of course, is a very significant month in world history. That's the beginning of the First World War. It opened just after the start of the First World War. The United States was not part of the First World War for the first 2 years. It cost about $375 million, which is about $8 billion today. And by the time of the Second World War, people began to realize it was too small. U.S. battleships were designed to be able to go through the canal with less than a foot on each side. And they did have to put in a second dam upstream on the Chagres River to preserve water. Every time a ship goes through the locks, around 50 million gallons of water. Some people say a maximum of 52 million gallons of water. How much water is used depends on the size of the ship. The bigger the ship, the less the water. But every time you go through, fresh water from the Chagres River, Gatun Lake is being dumped into the ocean, either on the Pacific or the Atlantic sides. So I've divided this talk into thirds, and hopefully we're getting through here. We'll see how we're doing on time. The first third was history. Now we're going to go fairly quickly through what we'll see tomorrow. First thing we'll see is Panama City, if you were up early. I talked with Andy this morning, and they had just gotten the information that's important here. The pilot will come on board at 6:30 tomorrow morning. And we will be seeing about this image of Panama City off in the distance there when the pilot comes on. We'll be right about where this picture is taken. Incidentally, you've got some really nice big modern high buildings there. The tallest building used to be named after a man that ran hotels. Some of you may be familiar with that name. The people no longer are using that particular name for that particular building in downtown Panama City. I'm not mentioning the name, but you may guess as to what former hotel owner had his name on the tallest building in Panama City. But after the pilot comes on, we will be about here, and this thing here in the foreground there, that's the breakwater that was built with some of the spoils from the construction of the canal. And one of the real things that you see there is this biomuseo. It's an ecological museum. It was designed by Frank Gehry, one of the world's most famous architects, opened a couple years ago. And then the thing we'll see, and this is, I think, let's look at time. We will be getting to this point probably somewhere around 7:30 in the morning, and hopefully you're up by then. This used to be referred to as the Thatcher Ferry Bridge, because in the old days there were ferries at both ends were the easy way to get across the canal, and so there was something called the Thatcher Ferry. When they built this bridge, they called it the Thatcher Ferry Bridge. It's now more often called the Bridge of the Americas. I took this picture out the window of an airplane after having taken off from Panama City and looking down. And if you look carefully, you can actually see the pilings from the old Thatcher Ferry landings. This is on the west side, and this is, I think, on the east side. So you can still see the remnants of that going back to before that bridge was built. There's the bridge again. After we go past that, on the right-hand side, mainly we'll see the Balboa port. And this is a container terminal. There is also some new stuff on the opposite side, on the west side or port side of the ship. Many of the big container ships are not going through the Panama Canal. What they're doing is coming here into Balboa and unloading and sending their cargo of containers across to the Caribbean side. And then on the Caribbean side, they're being distributed in many different directions. So a single ship will be carrying stuff from China to Balboa and then go across the isthmus on the railroad with the containers, and then on the Caribbean side at Cologne, those same containers might go some to Venezuela and some to New Orleans and some to New York City or wherever. It's what we call a break-in bulk point, and it's an easy way to send things off in different directions. So you'll see some really big container ships there. And when we go along, there are 2 or 3 spots where you might be able to see the railroad. And hopefully, well, maybe you'll see a railroad. Hopefully we have a train. Oh, there he is. And notice the train is basically carrying containers. Full ones going to the Caribbean, empty ones coming the opposite direction. So we'll see lots of containers. Over half of the ships going through the canal these days are container ships. Then we'll go into the Miraflores locks. We will hit the Miraflores locks at 8:30 is our scheduled time. We will be in the left hand of those lanes tomorrow morning. And it will take us about an hour, a little over an hour to get through the 2 steps of the locks here. We'll come out of here at 9:30 in the morning. There's a cruise ships coming in, and this is looking down. On the left-hand side of this picture, it's actually on the east side of the canal, there is a visitor center. This is in the middle of the locks, there is a control room. There's the visitor center. If you have grandchildren, friends, or whatever following your voyage, there is that tower on the right-hand side of that building, that red and white tower, and up on the very top of that tower, there is a camera, and it's a webcam, and you can tell your friends to check it out and give you a wave. There's usually lots of people watching ships go through here. It's a very popular spot. This was from May when I went through, and there is a little bit of change here. I don't really show it in this image. It's around on the back side. They're building a huge museum of the history of the canal that's just around the corner there. You can also see that tower there on the right that has the webcam up on the top. This is an old photo from, I think this is from 2007 or 2008. I wanted to show you these. That crane there is called the Titan crane. It was actually built in Germany before the Second World War. It was captured by the United States at the end of the Second World War. It was used in San Diego for a number of years and then sent down to Panama. And when we went through on this time here, the Titan crane was helping work on the right hand or east side locks here at Miraflores. And it's the only time I've ever seen the lock totally empty. So you're looking down into the lock, and you won't see that today. This is because they were working to do some reconstruction effort. They use these little engines. They're called mules. The ones that they have today are the 3rd set of mules. They don't tow us through. The ship goes through under its own power, but what they do is steady us and keep us centered. This is leaving the Miraflores locks, and then here the next set is a single lock, one raise at Pedro Miguel. And there's a ship coming in, and the mules there are simply centering the ship. This is a fairly big one, probably only has a foot or so on each side as clearance. And on some of the bigger cruise ships, I've gone through here on Celebrity, Norwegian, and Princess ships, they only have about 18 inches of clearance on each side. So it's fairly tight. We, of course, are a bit smaller, so we won't be quite as tight as that. The guy there in the hat is a pilot. On the big cruise ships, they use 3 pilots. 2 are up on the bridge, and one, like this guy, was in the back helping to make sure that the back didn't touch. I talked to him for about a half an hour. It's interesting. He was doing about his 4,000th crossing transit through the canal. He had been working for almost 40 years. This is what's called a Panama Canal stripe. Some of the big ships get a little close. And my friend Bill Fall there on the right-hand side is a lecturer on cruise ships, and he only does the Panama Canal lectures. He does a narration on Celebrity, so when they do the transit, he's the one that's talking from the bridge. We will have somebody from Panama as our narrator. But there's the stripe. This is a little bit of a long video, but I wanted to show you this, hopefully. Yeah, there we are. This is the Pedro Miguel locks. And this ship is coming in from the Gatun Lake into the locks. You may notice he's not coming in quite straight. I found this video on the web on YouTube, so I just grabbed it off, but it's a great video. I've already showed you what a Panama Canal stripe looks like. These guys up on the ship here at the front with the light-colored shirts are the deckhands from Panama. They're called the line handlers, and they do all of the holding of lines. The crew on the ship doesn't do anything in terms of that. They're the guys that do that. But this is a pretty big container ship coming into the Pedro Miguel locks. Keep your eye on that second mule. Watch that second mule. And watch the guy here from the front one jumping down from his mule. I presume that the ship there had insurance for mule collisions, but that mule is pretty badly damaged. And you'll see some sparks. They're electric, and it starts to smoke and so forth. Okay. Once we're past those set of locks, we're now up at the level of Gatun Lake. We will see this bridge. It was called the Centennial Bridge. It was supposed to be finished by the time Panama celebrated its centennial back in 1903. It wasn't finished by then, but it is the better, bigger bridge on the Pacific side. Incidentally, big cruise ships cannot go through the canal. They can go partly through to Lake Gatun, but they cannot go all the way through. The Bridge of the Americas, that first bridge we saw, is too low for the biggest cruise ships to go under. So if you have a big ship, a big cruise ship, they will come in from the Caribbean side. They will go through the new locks. They will go into Gatun Lake, turn around, and go back out. It's called a partial transit. We will be doing the full transit. Then we'll go through the Galliard Cut, or what used to be called the Culebras Cut. It's where they go through the backbone of Panama, the Continental Divide. It's where they had the biggest problem with the slope and the landslides. And then once we're past that, we will go out towards Gatun Lake. We'll be at the level of Gatun Lake here. There is a place in the middle called Gamboa where the big cranes and dredges are kept. There's a Titan crane that we saw earlier. There are other dredges stationed there. It's kind of the maintenance depot for the canal. And then we'll be out in Gatun Lake. When we're out in Gatun Lake, we'll probably see a lot of ships anchored there. People think that the canal is a two-way route, that there are 2 lanes of the old canal. One is up, one is down. You see ships going the opposite direction. Not true. For 4 or 5 hours every day, ships will go through in the same direction. We will have a ship probably parallel next to us as we go through. And then they reverse direction for 5 or 6 hours, and ships go through in the opposite direction. So Gatun Lake is used as kind of the anchorage, waiting for that change of direction. So we'll see lots of ships out there. I mentioned Gatun Lake is supposed to be 85 feet above sea level. Panama has had a big drought for the last 5 years. When I checked the other day, it is at 82 feet now. And these are recent pictures. We will actually see in several different places stumps of old trees that are now visible because the lake is so low. Oops. Let me back that one up. Some of you saw crocodiles yesterday. I think this is probably a caiman rather than a crocodile, but that is along the shores of Lake Gatun. If you're real lucky, you might see something like that. I took these pictures in May in a small boat. We're not going to get that close to some of the little islands. We may actually see some birds. We probably won't see this. This is a howler monkey. Can you spot him? He's right there. Some of us on the shore excursions yesterday, I think as we were coming back, our bus stopped and we saw some of the capuchin white-faced monkeys. But you'll see spots like this. These are stumps from the canal that most of the time, a normal year, you wouldn't see, but now with the lake level so low, you will see some of these old stumps. And then we get to the Gatun locks on the Caribbean side, and we have to go down 3 steps there. And you'll see a ship like this that looks real big, and then that ship sinks. The water is drained out of the lock, and down it goes. The gates open in front, and it goes down to the next level and does the same thing and the same thing. That's the Gatun locks. One of the things that's interesting, you look for this, every time we go through the locks, the line handlers on the ship will have to get cables from the mules before we go through. And how do they get the cables from the locks to the ship? You'd think, well, they have some sort of sophisticated system of doing it. No, they use rowboats. They have not come up with anything that is more reliable than rowboats. You look for that. These are the Gatun locks we're leaving at this level. That's the Gatun locks. Again, something I want to point out on the starboard side as we leave the Gatun locks. And when we go through the Gatun locks, I think we'll be on the right-hand set of locks. We'll be entering the Gatun locks at 2:40, and we'll be coming out at about 6:40. 2:40 and 4:40, 16:40. So about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we should be about where this picture is. And if you're looking on the right-hand side, about 150 feet, 200 feet past the Gatun locks, right in this area, right in there, there's oftentimes a crocodile. He's up on the bank or he's just down close to the water, but you can usually spot a crocodile in that area. As we go past, again, we'll see on the port side the old French Canal. And that's looking down the old French Canal. It's the only time that you will see anything related to the French Canal, except at one of the visitor centers. I think at Miraflores, there is one of the very, very early mules. It's the one that dates back to 1914, the early American one. We saw the 2 bridges on the Pacific side, the Bridge of the Americas and the Centennial Bridge. There has not been a real big permanent bridge on the Caribbean side. There is a swing bridge that's tied in with the locks at Gatun, but they are building a bridge on the Caribbean side. And this is back in 2017, and there's early 2018. 2018, and it was coming along and coming along and coming along. Here's 2018, and there's 2019 early this year, and the last time I went through in May. This time here tomorrow will be my 10th time in the last 3 years. And you see the bridge is almost finished. Unfortunately, it's not yet connected into the road system, so they haven't built the roads that lead up to the bridge yet. This was in May. But it's almost done, and it's high enough so that big ships can go underneath it. And then we'll come out at Cologne. We will not actually see this. This is in the bay at Cologne. We will be sailing past this. Again, it's a big container port where some of the containers are sent off in various directions. And then we'll be out in the bay and sailing in the Caribbean, heading off to Cartagena. Now, the last third of my talk is on the new canal. They realized a long time ago, back in the Second World War, that the canal was not big enough. And so what they've done is a couple of different things to do to change the canal. First of all, they have straightened some places as you go through Gatun Lake. They've made it straighter so bigger ships don't have to make so many turns and do so much maneuvering. They've widened the Gaillard Cut, or the Calabres Cut, moved it back. They've deepened the channel, particularly in the Gaillard Cut area. And then they've built two new sets of locks. On the Caribbean side, they're called the Agua Clara locks, and they're called the Cocoli locks at the Pacific side. So we'll see the Cocoli locks first, and then we may see them a little bit on the Caribbean side. The project was started in 2006. They opened it in 2016. It was a group of companies, mainly European companies, that were involved. There was one American company that was part of the design of it, but it was supposed to cost about $5 billion. They started construction in 2009, and they were way behind schedule. It was supposed to open in 2014. It actually opened in 2016. Way over budget. I have not yet seen a good number as to what it really cost. The companies that were part of the consortium are still fighting to get more money out of Panama. Panama is fighting with them to pay less, and we have not yet had a real good total number what it really cost to build. The numbers here are important, and this is a number that you probably are not familiar with, the number TEU. TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit, a 20-foot container equivalent unit. Now, when we go through, you'll see many of the containers are not 20-footers, which are little short ones. They're probably 40 feet. So a 40-foot container is 2 TEU. But in international shipping, everything is talked in terms of TEUs. The biggest ships that could go through the old locks were 4,800 TEU. And the new locks, in theory, are something above 12,000 TEU. So more than double the number of containers on a ship that would go through the new locks. The new locks are longer, they are wider, they are deeper. Or seen another way, here or here. The old locks, roughly 14,000. The new locks, as much as about 13,000, 12,600 to 12,800. They hold more down under. When you see these container ships, you see lots of containers above the decks. What you need to think about, there's just as many containers below the deck of the ship. Something to note, there are ships currently under construction that are above 21,000, almost 22,000 TEU. The Panama Canal, maximum size, about 12,006 or 12,800, no more than 12,000 or 13,000. So there are already ships under construction that are twice as big as can go through the new locks. You might say, where in the world are they going to use them? They can go through the Suez Canal. They can go from China to Europe, or they can go from China to West Coast United States. Los Angeles will be able to hold them. Or they can go into the Balboa lock or Balboa port and unload there and send them the containers across on the railroad. There are already cruise ships that are too big to go through. As I mentioned, they can't go all the way through because they can't go under the Bridge of the Americas. Some of the really big ones, the 5,000, 6,000 passenger cruise ships, cannot get under the bridge of the Americas. There is talk about replacing that bridge or doing something, but they haven't done it yet. Here's what we will be seeing on the right-hand side. The Miraflores locks is where we will be seeing. If you look on the left-hand side as we go through there, the Coco Lee locks on the Pacific side will be on our left-hand side. And the thing about them that's interesting, although the locks are bigger, they've worked out a way in which they can reuse over half the water each time. They put the water slides off into a basin on the side, like you see over here on the side of the locks. And so they don't use any more water for a bigger ship to go through. They're designed in such a way as they use about the same amount of water. This is a video from the Panama Canal Administration. One of the big things about the new locks is that they do not have the swing gates like the ones we will be going through. They have a sliding gate that goes into a pocket on the side. That's the control tower. In 2 minutes, we've just seen the entire construction. A few videos or a few photos that I found on the web of the construction project. It was a massive undertaking. These are my photos. This is what we will see on the Pacific side. You can see the Coco Lee locks over there on the port side of the ship. That's the Coco Lee locks as we've gotten into Miraflores lakes. This is all the buildings of the Coco Lee locks. The Coco Lee locks on the Pacific side raise the ship in 3 steps, whereas we will do 2 steps, Miraflores Lakes, Pedro Miguel locks, the 3rd step. So for a stretch of more than 2 miles, the ships will be running parallel to us, but above us, because they will have already come up that. This is at the the Caribbean side. Gatun locks are there on the right. If you look back, you will be able to see the Agua Clara locks on the Caribbean side, but we don't really get a good view. These trees here in the foreground will block it from us as we're in the Gatun lock area. But we get a little bit of a view. There is a visitor station above the Agua Clara locks. You can look down on it. I'll show you that in a minute. This is on the Caribbean side. The Agua Clara locks. The gates were built in Spain, I think, and shipped over on one of these very large vessels, 4 at a time, and then maneuvered into position, brought on land on very big transporters. These are hundreds of tons, and then taken up a road that runs right through the center here into the locks, and then swung into position. And again, they are swing gates, they are sliding gates rather than swing gates. So they go into a pocket into the wall and open and close. There are two of them because that allows them to work on one. If they have to do any repairs, they can still have the new canal working while they're doing any fixing on one of the gates. When they were finished, they did a test, and the darn thing leaked. That is also a big controversy, and who will pay for that? They had to send in basically caulk these leaks, but that was a big embarrassment for the companies that were building. This is on the Gatun side. That's the Gatun locks there on the right-hand side, and the Coco Lee locks, or the Agua Clara locks on the left-hand side. My friend Bill Fall, that does the lectures on celebrity, sent me this picture. He was on one of the tugboats going through. There's one of the big ships going into the new locks. That's at Coco Lee on the Pacific side. And there is a stretch there when we're in Lake Miraflores where the ships will be, on the new canal, will be about 30 feet above us. And they will be just kind of sailing along. I took this video, if it plays. May not play. This was one in May. My friend Bill took this picture again with the tugboat getting ready to pull a ship into the new lock. The really big container ships will be going through the new locks. They're doing an average of about 13 ships through the new locks every day. They only do it in daytime now. They have not yet started to do it at night. And among other ships, we'll see lots of container ships. We'll probably see one or two other cruise ships. We'll see lots of ships like this that are either liquefied natural gas or propane, naphtha or something like that. Some of the liquid gases. This is a picture I took from the visitor center at Agua Clara. We're looking down on those swing gates. I've been up at that visitor center twice now, and when I was there in May, we got there. The guide said we'll have 45 minutes. He came back about 2 minutes later and said, well, there's no ships going through while we're here, so we're only going to say about 25 minutes, 20 minutes. We were time enough to see a little video and then go out. This is the new locks picture, a picture I took looking down from the Agua Clara Visitor Center. But in May, there was nobody going through. The thing that's really interesting, if you notice, there's no mules. There's nothing holding the boat in the center. With the swing gates, or excuse me, with the sliding gate, there's no way to have the mules because that gate moves back and forth and the mule couldn't do it. So what they've done is that they have a tugboat at the back and a tugboat at the front, and the tugboat has to work to keep that ship centered. What does it cost to go through the canal? Well, I've gone on the web and I've looked to see the various costs for a big container ship, well, the biggest that could go through the new locks, 13,000 TEU. They use tugs to guide it into the new locks, and they have one at the front and the back. So do you need 4 tugs? Do you need 6 tugs? Depending on how many tugs you use, you have a fee. How many line handlers do you have onto the ship? That costs you. There is a security charge of $1,000 and an oil pollution fee, and you have to get your money in. Before we go through the canal, we have got to pay. It's done by wire transfer 3 days ahead, and there are various bank charges, so the banks have to make a little money, about $3,000. You have to be fumigated, so they charge you for that. And then they charge you for using their radio system, so there's a fee for that. And the miscellaneous, there are a whole series of little charges, a couple $1,000s. And then after all that is done, then there's the toll. And the toll is based on the size of the ship, the type of ship, the liquid petroleum, the gas ships, those charge more because they're more dangerous. On the container ships, are the containers empty or are they full? That makes a difference. How many containers empty, how many containers full? You get a discount if you're a container ship company and you run through the canal many times a year. You get a discount for that. But in our hypothetical one, the toll would be a little over $1 million. But we're not a cargo ship, we're a cruise ship. So we're based on size, and we're based on a number of what are called lower berth bunks. When a ship is registered, its tonnage is recorded with Lloyd's of London officially, and how many beds are there. So the fold-down beds on some ships don't count in terms of that number. The number of passengers. So if you have people 3 to a cabin with a fold-down bunk, it's worked out with the number of passengers. Incidentally, on some ships that I've worked on, I have been a crew member. On this ship, I'm a passenger. That means that the ship is paying for me to go through, whereas on some ships, if they have a lot of lecturers or singers, dancers, they put those onto the crew list, and so they essentially get that person through for free. You pay for an advance reservation. If you are looking at the future cruises, you know that on such and such a date in 2021, a ship will be in such and such a port. So for us to be predicted to be going through tomorrow, they have had to pay for that advance reservation. We pay extra for going through in daylight. The canal, the old locks at least, run 24 hours a day, and the cruise ships obviously want to go through during the daytime. But it's typically between about $250,000 and $500,000 for cruise ships. The highest fee that I've seen for a cruise ship was the Norwegian Bliss, which is, I think, close to 6,000 passengers, paid over $1 million. We're about the 250,000 range. I'm not sure why that video is not playing. I wanted to show you one picture, and this one, it should be a little video, but we're not getting it for some reason. I don't have a lecture for Cartagena. Usually I talk about the next port, and obviously it's much more important for this voyage that we get the Panama Canal. I love Cartagena. I've been there many, many times. I love the Old Town. Various tours that do the Old Town. There's several different variations. If you're not going ashore to go on any of the ship's excursions, at least go ashore. There's a nice little visitor center, and in the visitor center, it's got some shops. There's a shuttle bus that takes you over there. There is adjacent to that kind of a mini zoo, and it's always got some toucans, some parrots, a variety of birds, and this was supposed to be a little video to show you, to encourage you to at least get off the ship day after tomorrow when we're in Cartagena and go at least to that small little visitor center, sit there and watch the parrots and parakeets and so forth. My next talk is going to be 2 days from now, Sunday afternoon. I've done mainly morning ones, but my next one is going to be in the afternoon. It's the early Spanish Main. I'll be talking about the first generation or so of the Spanish in the Caribbean, some of the early Portuguese explorers, Spanish explorers, and I will have a little bit on Panama there, the first initial settlements in Panama and explorations in Panama. Hopefully we'll see you then.